The town of Duskwood lay buried in the endless expanse of northern Canada, a cluster of old wooden houses surrounded by forests so vast and silent they seemed to have no end. Winters here stretched longer than they should, swallowing months in sheets of ice and fog. Even in summer, when the sun lingered late, the forests stood dark, as if the trees themselves resisted the light. Duskwood was small, barely 200 residents. People here knew one another by name, and gossip traveled faster than the icy wind that cut across the lakes. To outsiders, it was just another forgotten town. But those who lived here, they felt something pressing down on them, like the weight of unseen eyes. For as long as anyone could remember, Duskwood carried whispers of hauntings. The stories were dismissed as folklore, told by old trappers and drunk fishermen. Pale women seen on frozen roads, whispers in the forest when no one else was near, faces in the fog. But in the past few weeks, the whispers had grown. It started with Matthew Clark, a logger who vanished on his way home from the mill. They found his truck parked on the roadside, headlights still on, the engine rumbling. The door stood wide open, footprints in the snow leading into the trees. But the tracks didn't go far. They stopped abruptly, as though Matthew had been lifted into the air. He was never found. Then came Mrs. Beauchard, the widowed baker who lived above her shop. Her neighbors claimed to hear her screaming late at night. When they broke into her home the next morning, they found her body sitting in a chair by the window. Her mouth was stretched wide, frozen in terror. The coroner said her heart had simply stopped. By the time the third death occurred, an entire family found lifeless in their beds, eyes wide open, skin cold as stone. The town was drowning in fear. And it was on that night, under the pale light of a swollen moon, that the ghosts showed themselves. The first to see them was Noah McAllister, the town's only constable. He had been patrolling near the frozen lake, his flashlight barely piercing the fog that hung low on the ice. The silence was unnatural, as though even the forest animals had fled. Then, from the mist, he saw movement, figures, many of them, standing still on the ice. At first, Noah thought they were townsfolk, maybe searching for Matthew or keeping vigil. But when he called out, the figures didn't move. They simply stared. He raised his flashlight. The beam revealed faces that were pale, translucent, their mouths twisted open in silent screams. Their eyes were pits of blackness, endless and hollow. Noah staggered back, heart pounding, and as he watched, the figures began to drift closer, gliding across the ice without sound, without steps. Their mouths widened, and though no breath left them, the air filled with whispers, thousands of voices speaking at once, all broken, all desperate. He ran. By dawn, the entire town had heard Noah's account. Many didn't want to believe it, but others admitted they too had seen shadows moving through their houses, faces pressed against windows, shapes drifting down the streets after midnight. The hauntings were no longer whispers of the past. They were here, now, consuming Duskwood. Fear changed the town overnight. Shops closed early. Parents kept their children inside. Windows were nailed shut, doors reinforced. Church bells tolled through the day, though the priest had no sermons to comfort his congregation. But none of it helped. Every night, as darkness fell, the ghosts came. They floated through the streets, pale and wretched, their whispers pressing into the minds of the living. Some people claimed the voices called their names. Others swore the spirits clawed at their dreams, dragging them toward madness. And when morning returned, more were dead, some of fright, others simply gone, vanished like Matthew Clark, leaving behind homes with food still cooking, doors left ajar, chairs rocking slowly as though someone had just stood up. Among the frightened was Elena Byrne, a schoolteacher who had lived in Duskwood all her life. She had never believed in the stories. Ghosts were for children and campfires. But now she locked her doors too. On the third night of the hauntings, Elena was awakened by a sound, scratching against her window. She sat up, heart hammering, and saw a figure outside. At first she thought it was a man, but as the figure drew closer, she realized its face was wrong. The skin seemed stretched, sagging, and where its eyes should have been were empty sockets, blacker than the night itself. The scratching grew louder, nails raking against the glass. Then the whispers started, right in her head, as though the voice was inside her skull. "Let us in." She couldn't move, couldn't scream. The air in her room grew colder and colder until she could see her breath. And then, silence. The figure was gone. But in the corner of her room, a wet footprint stained the wooden floor. By the end of the week, the town was breaking apart. The mayor, desperate to maintain order, tried to rally the townsfolk in the church, claiming it was holy ground and would protect them. Dozens huddled inside, clutching rosaries, praying. But when the bells rang that night, the ghosts came anyway. They slid through the church walls as though they were mist. Their whispers drowned out the prayers, and the candles flickered and died. People screamed, children wailed, and one by one the townsfolk collapsed, some lifeless, others dragged into the shadows, their cries fading into nothingness. When the survivor stumbled out at dawn, the pews were soaked with frost, and 13 people were missing. Duskwood was no longer a town. It was a graveyard waiting to be filled. And deep in the forest, beyond the frozen lake, something stirred, something older, darker, and far more powerful than the pale wraiths haunting the streets. It had been waiting for centuries, buried in silence. Now, awakened by fear and death, it had begun to rise. The people of Duskwood had seen ghosts, but what was coming next would make the ghosts seem merciful. The morning after the massacre in the church, Duskwood was hushed, not the ordinary silence of a small town, but a suffocating absence of sound, as though the ghosts had stolen every whisper of life. The streets lay empty, doors remained bolted, curtains drawn. Even the crows that usually haunted the power lines had fled. Constable Noah McAllister tried to hold his post, walking the streets with his rifle slung across his chest, but the weight of unseen eyes pressed on him at every step. He hadn't slept in days. His uniform smelled of cold sweat and gun oil. When he passed the baker's old shop, he paused. The windows were frosted on the inside, but behind the ice, faint shapes pressed against the glass, like hands. He told himself it was a trick of the light. He didn't dare go inside. The survivors began gathering in small groups, whispering theories, each story worse than the last. Some said the dead had risen to punish them for some hidden sin. Others swore the forest itself had turned against them. But a few older voices remembered more. It was Agnes Tremblay, the town's eldest resident, who broke the silence first. She sat on her porch wrapped in blankets, her eyes milky with cataracts. Children avoided her house. She was known as a strange woman, always muttering to herself. But now, with terror choking the town, people listened. "You think this is new. It isn't. Duskwood was cursed long before you were born, long before I was born. This land is soaked in blood, and the dead, they have come to collect what was promised." No one wanted to believe her, but when pressed, Agnes told them a story. Centuries ago, long before Duskwood existed, the land belonged to the Anishinaabe people.
They called the lake by a name that roughly translated to the mouth of winter. Legends told of spirits beneath the ice, bound there after a great battle between shamans and something unspeakable. When French trappers arrived in the 1700s, they ignored the warnings. They built cabins by the lake, desecrated sacred grounds, and took what they wanted. The winter that followed was said to be the harshest in history. Entire camps froze to death. Survivors claimed to hear voices calling them onto the ice, where they vanished forever. Later, in the 1800s, settlers came and founded Duskwood. They built the church on what had once been a burial ground, chopping down the great cedar trees the Anishinaabe had planted as guardians. "From that day," Agnes whispered, "we have lived under borrowed time. The spirits never left, they waited. And now, the ice has broken." While many dismissed her as senile, others were shaken. Elena Byrne, the schoolteacher, couldn't stop thinking about it. She had grown up hearing fragments of those legends, but always as bedtime stories, not warnings. Now the pieces fit together in ways she didn't want them to. That night, Elena dreamed she was standing on the frozen lake. The ice beneath her feet was thin, spiderweb cracks spreading outward. Below, in the black water, faces stared up, pale, eyeless, screaming. She tried to run, but the ice shattered, pulling her down into the freezing abyss. She woke, drenched in sweat, the whisper still in her ears. The debt must be paid. Meanwhile, the hauntings grew worse. Doors unlocked themselves. Lights flickered even when the power was cut. People reported mirrors filling with fog, and in the haze, faces peered out that weren't their own. One man, Harold Keene, set fire to his own house after claiming the walls were breathing. He staggered into the snow, laughing hysterically as flames devoured his home, his family's photographs curling into ash. But the fire spread no warmth. Neighbors swore they saw shapes dancing in the smoke, twisting into skeletal forms before vanishing into the night. Harold was found dead by morning, lying in the ashes with his eyes frozen wide, his tongue black as tar. Constable Noah gathered a handful of men to search for answers in the forest, near the lake where the first ghosts had appeared. Armed with rifles and lanterns, they ventured into the mist. The snow muffled their footsteps, the trees looming like black spires. The deeper they went, the colder it grew. Breath froze instantly in the air. Their lanterns flickered, though the oil was fresh. Then they found something. An old cairn of stones hidden beneath the snow, marked with symbols no one recognized. The stones pulsed with frost, colder than ice. "Looks like some kind of grave," one of the men muttered. But before they could investigate further, the air filled with whispers. The men spun in every direction, rifles raised, but there was nothing, only the fog thickening around them. Then one of them screamed. The lantern light caught his face just as he was pulled backward into the trees. His body vanished in an instant, the scream cut short, leaving only the echo. Panic set in. The men fired wildly into the mist, bullets cracking through the branches. But the whispers only grew louder, overlapping, 1,000 voices chanting in unison. By the time Noah staggered back into town, he was alone. His men had simply disappeared.
News of the failed expedition spread quickly. Fear turned to hysteria. Families packed their cars, hoping to escape, but every road out of town was swallowed by fog. Engines failed, tires froze in place, and some who tried to walk the highway swore they found themselves back at the same crossroads, as if the town had folded in on itself. Duskwood was a cage. Elena, desperate for answers, turned to Agnes Tremblay again. The old woman sat in her rocking chair, muttering prayers in French and Anishinaabe. "You cannot fight them with bullets," Agnes told her. "These are not ghosts. They are revenants, bound here by a wound that was never healed. The land remembers. The dead remember." "Then how do we stop it?" Elena pressed. Agnes shook her head. "You don't. You can only appease them. Blood was taken unjustly. Blood must be given." The words chilled Elena more than the ghosts ever could. That night, the apparitions grew bolder. Instead of drifting outside homes, they entered freely. Families awoke to find pale figures standing at the foot of their beds, whispering their names. Frost crawled across walls, covering pictures, furniture, even skin. One by one, people vanished in their sleep. Some left only twisted bedsheets behind. Others were found outside, barefoot in the snow, their bodies frozen solid, arms reaching toward the forest. The town's population, once 200, was dwindling by the night. And still, something deeper stirred. On the 7th night, a sound echoed through Duskwood. It was not human. It was a groan, low and thunderous, shaking the very ground. Windows shattered, dogs howled, and the frozen lake cracked wide, jagged lines splitting across its surface. From beneath the ice, shapes began to rise. Not just the pale spirits of townsfolk, but something larger, darker. Shadowed forms with elongated limbs crawling out of the water as though the lake itself had birthed them. Their eyes glowed faintly, not with light, but with hunger. The ghosts had been the beginning. These were their masters. Elena stood at her window as the creatures moved through the mist, their whispers swelling into a deafening roar. She knew then that Duskwood had no future, no hope. The town had awakened something ancient, and it had come to claim them all. And as the clock struck midnight, the power in Duskwood went out for the last time. The streets plunged into blackness, illuminated only by the pale glow of the dead. The siege had begun. Duskwood had become unrecognizable. Where once there were warm lights glowing from kitchen windows and laughter spilling out of the bar, now there was only darkness. The town's power grid had died with the 7th night, and no one dared to light more than a candle. Even fire seemed feeble against the shadows that prowled the streets. The air itself felt poisoned. A smell like wet soil and rotting leaves clung to everything, seeping through cracks in the walls. Frost coated doorknobs and mirrors, spreading like veins of ice. And always, the whispers. They never stopped. Morning or night, whether one was awake or dreaming, the voices filled the air. Sometimes pleading, sometimes mocking, always pushing closer to the brink of madness. Constable Noah McAllister no longer patrolled. He had barricaded himself inside the police station with what little ammunition he had left. His journal, found later among the rubble, described the town's decline. The dead are not content to haunt anymore. They are hunting. We hear them scratching at the doors. We see their shadows moving beneath the cracks. They want us outside. And if we resist, they come inside. I don't know how much longer we can hold out. The pages became less coherent as the days passed, words scrawled in shaking lines, sentences breaking apart. They call my name. Not just ghosts, something older. The lake is opening. God help us all. Elena Byrne refused to surrender. Her students, what few children remained, huddled in her house with their parents, clutching blankets and stuffed animals while the walls creaked with the weight of unseen hands. Elena tried to read to them by candlelight, but her voice shook, and the children stared at her with wide, hollow eyes. "Tell us the story again," little Sophie begged. "The one where the people escape." Elena swallowed hard. There was no such story. Not here.
but she told it anyway, inventing a tale of a town that broke free from the curse, where the dead were laid to rest and the children could play in the sunlight again. Her voice cracked halfway through. She prayed the children didn't notice. The church was abandoned now, its doors hanging loose, pews coated in frost. Yet some townsfolk still clung to faith. They wandered through the snow, clutching crosses, singing hymns that dissolved into sobs. The revenants followed them like wolves, gliding behind them in the fog. One by one, the singers fell silent. Their bodies were never recovered.
Others chose violence. Armed men roamed the streets, firing blindly at shadows, accusing neighbors of bringing the curse. Houses were burned, screams echoing through the night. In the chaos, the line between the living and the dead blurred. Everyone was a ghost in waiting. On the 10th night, the ground itself began to change. The frozen lake cracked open wider, sending tremors through the earth. Water surged upward, flooding streets with black slush that stank of decay. From the fissures emerged more of the towering shapes, the masters of the revenants. Their bodies were made of shadow and ice, limbs elongated, their faces blank voids. Wherever they passed, windows shattered, and frost bloomed across entire houses. The ghosts were tormentors. These were executioners. Desperation drove Elena to Agnes Tremblay one final time. The old woman was frail, but her eyes burned with grim certainty. "They cannot be fought," Agnes croaked, "but they can be bound. The Anishinaabe shamans did it once before. They trapped the darkness beneath the lake, but the binding requires sacrifice. Blood for blood." Elena's throat tightened. Whose blood? Agnes fixed her with a stare that seemed to pierce her very soul. "The town's, all of it. Only then will the spirits rest." Elena recoiled. "That's not a solution, that's extermination." But Agnes only closed her eyes, rocking slowly in her chair. The debt must be paid, one way or another. Meanwhile, Constable Noah began to unravel. Witnesses claimed to see him pacing the streets at night, muttering to himself, gun in hand. Sometimes he would raise the weapon at the shadows, screaming names of people long dead. Other times, he simply stared at the frozen lake, as though listening to something beneath it. On the 11th night, Noah vanished. His journal was found abandoned at the water's edge, the final words smeared by frost. "I hear them. They are inside me now." The town's population shrank to less than 50. Entire families had vanished. Streets once familiar now seemed endless, twisted by fog and silence. Survivors began gathering in one place, the old schoolhouse, hoping numbers might protect them. Elena stood at the front of the classroom, chalk still clinging to the blackboard. She tried to organize them, to give them purpose, but fear gnawed at every face. Then the whispers changed. No longer distant, they grew sharp, directed, calling each survivor by name. The revenants knew who was left. They knew where they hid. That night, the schoolhouse windows rattled as pale figures crowded outside. Children wailed. Adults clutched rifles and knives, though they knew weapons meant nothing. The whispers grew until they became screams. Frost burst across the walls, candles extinguished, and the door creaked open though no one touched it. Elena screamed for everyone to run. Chaos erupted. Parents carried children through the back hallways as shadows slid along the ceiling. One man fired his shotgun into the dark, only for the blast to reveal his wife's face twisted among the revenants, mouth open in an endless scream. The survivors scattered into the snow. The ghosts pursued relentlessly, gliding faster than running feet. One by one, people fell, dragged screaming into the mist. Elena clutched Sophie's hand, running through the frozen streets. The girl stumbled, sobbing, But Elena dragged her onward. She had no destination, only away, always away. But the whispers followed. Elena, Sophie, come home. By dawn, only a handful remained. They huddled in basements, barns, abandoned trucks, trembling and sleepless. And then came the 12th night. The revenants did not roam the streets this time. They gathered, every ghost and shadow by the frozen lake. Survivors peeked from windows and saw them, hundreds of pale figures standing in silent rows, facing the black water. The ice cracked open, a yawning maw, and from its depths rose something vast, not a figure, not a ghost, but a presence. Darkness itself took form, blotting out the moon. Its voice was not a whisper, but a roar, a vibration that shook bones and shattered glass. Every survivor in Duskwood heard it, and every heart knew this was the true master of the curse, the Humber that had waited centuries.
It had awakened fully. Elena knew then there was no escape. The town was lost. The only question was how much longer they had before the darkness consumed everything. She held Sophie close as the roar reverberated through the night. The girl's small body shook, and Elena whispered the lie again, the story of the people who escaped. But even as she spoke, she knew the ending had already been written. Duskwood was doomed. The 12th night bled into the 13th without dawn. Snow fell endlessly, but it was no longer white. Each flake was tinged gray as though ash had mingled with the storm. The moon had vanished behind clouds that never broke, leaving Duskwood cloaked in a darkness deeper than night. The revenants no longer stalked the streets. They stood frozen in place, hundreds of them, their pale faces turned toward the lake. Their whispers had ceased. They waited. The silence was worse than the voices. Elena Byrne, clutching Sophie, crept from the ruins of the schoolhouse. They were among fewer than 20 survivors now, scattered and broken, faces hollow with terror. Some wanted to flee again, though every attempt had ended in failure. Others begged Elena to lead them, as though her role as a teacher somehow granted her wisdom over death. She had none. Her only knowledge was the certainty that the town was nearing its end. And then, as if in answer to their despair, the lake groaned. The fissures widened, vomiting steam and shadow. The ground trembled beneath their feet. From the black water rose the figure they had glimpsed before, but now its full form towered over Duskwood. It was not flesh. It was not spirit. It was absence made visible. A colossus of shadow whose body bled mist. Its head was faceless, yet every survivor felt its gaze burning into them. The revenants raised their arms in unison, mouths gaping open in a scream that never came. They bowed before the thing that had birthed them. The townsfolk collapsed in the snow, clutching their ears as the silence pressed against them like a physical weight. Agnes Tremblay alone stood upright, leaning on her cane. Her voice, cracked and weak, rose above the storm. "It is the mouth of winter," she declared. "The hunger beneath the ice, the one the shamans bound, and now it is free." Her words trembled in the air, final and absolute. Elena stared at the towering shadow. She remembered Agnes's warning. The debt must be paid. "Blood for blood," Elena whispered. The survivors argued in panicked voices, desperation tearing them apart. Some screamed that they had to offer a sacrifice, choose someone, anyone, to appease the thing. Others refused, clinging to hope that there might be another way. The shouting grew until the revenants turned toward them, their pale faces stretched wide in grotesque grins.
The choice would soon be made for them. In the chaos, Noah McAllister returned, or what remained of him. He emerged from the fog, rifle still slung across his back, but his eyes were pits of shadow. His lips moved in silent mimicry of the whispers. The townsfolk backed away in horror as he stumbled forward, a puppet now, bound to the mouth of winter. "Elena," he croaked, his voice not his own. "Bring the child." Sophie buried her face in Elena's coat, trembling. "No," Elena hissed, holding the girl tighter. But Noah raised his rifle with unnatural strength, aiming it not at them, but at the sky. The shot cracked like thunder, a signal. The revenants advanced. The survivors scattered again, but nowhere was safe. The pale ghosts flowed through walls, through snow, through the air itself. One by one, people were dragged screaming into the fog. Their voices vanished instantly, as though swallowed whole. Elena ran, pulling Sophie behind her. The girl stumbled, crying out, but Elena would not let go. She had promised herself, promised the children that she would protect them. She ran until the ground gave way beneath her. They stood at the edge of the lake, fissures yawning at their feet. Black water lapped hungrily against the ice. The mouth of winter loomed above them, its shadow blotting out everything.
Agnes appeared beside them, dragged by unseen hands, her frail body trembling but her eyes fierce. "You cannot save the town," she whispered to Elena, "but you can save the child. Offer yourself. Blood for blood. The mouth demands it." Elena's throat closed. She looked down at Sophie, whose tiny fingers clutched hers desperately. The girl's eyes were wide, filled with the same terror that now haunted everyone in Duskwood. "No," Elena breathed. "There has to be another way." Agnes shook her head. "There isn't. There never was." The revenants encircled them, pale forms swaying in rhythm with the whispers that filled the air once more. Sophie sobbed, pressing her face into Elena's side. And then Elena felt it. The pull. The whispers weren't just sound. They were intent, wrapping around her thoughts, urging her forward, demanding her submission. She understood then. The curse had never been about the town. It was about feeding. The mouth of winter devoured souls, binding them to itself, until every living thing was nothing but another revenant, unless it was offered something willingly. Elena knelt in the snow, lifting Sophie's face to hers. "Listen to me," she whispered, fighting to steady her voice. "You have to run. Run and don't look back." Sophie shook her head violently, tears streaking her cheeks. "No, don't leave me." "I won't leave you," Elena said, her own tears freezing on her skin. "I'll be with you always, but you have to go." The revenants pressed closer, their hollow eyes fixed on the child. Elena stood, drawing in a shuddering breath, and screamed into the darkness, "Take me!" The mouth of winter shuddered, its faceless head tilting. The revenants froze in place, their whispers faltering. Elena stepped forward onto the ice, arms outstretched. The fissures split beneath her feet, but she did not stop. The shadows wrapped around her like chains, dragging her toward the gaping maw of the lake. Sophie's cries echoed behind her, but Elena didn't turn back. She met the void with unflinching eyes, and the mouth accepted. The scream that tore across Duskwood shook every remaining building, shattered every window, split the earth itself. The revenants convulsed, their pale bodies dissolving into mist. The towering shadow shrieked without a mouth, collapsing into the lake as the fissure sealed shut with thunderous cracks. The snow stopped falling. The silence that followed was absolute. When dawn finally broke, the survivors crept from their hiding places. The town was in ruins, houses collapsed, streets flooded with frozen black water, but the ghosts were gone. The whispers had ceased. Of Elena Byrne, there was no sign. Only Sophie remained,
sitting at the edge of the lake, clutching a single wet footprint frozen into the ice. In time, Duskwood emptied. The few who survived left and never returned. The town became another ghost itself, swallowed by the forest, forgotten by maps. But those who passed near the lake in years to come claimed to hear a faint voice in the wind, a woman's voice, whispering a lullaby. And sometimes, if the snow fell just right, footprints appeared across the ice, leading into the center of the lake and stopping where the fissures once opened. Because sacrifices are not endings, they are beginnings. The mouth of winter is patient, and one day, when the debt grows heavy again, it will hunger once more.